Have you ever wondered who the very first people were to call North America home, long before there were countries, cities, or even the name America? Small families quietly followed the rhythms of nature across a world covered in ice. They weren't searching for fame or discovery. They were simply trying to survive, and without ever knowing it, they were beginning one of the greatest journeys in human history. Before we continue tonight's story, if you enjoy peaceful history that helps you relax and fall asleep, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's travel back more than 20,000 years to a world almost beyond imagination. The morning began in silence. Not the silence of an empty world, but the quiet breathing of nature itself. A cold wind drifted across endless grasslands, carrying tiny crystals of snow that sparkled beneath the pale morning sun. In every direction stretched a landscape untouched by roads, villages, or farms. There were no kingdoms, no borders, no written history, only rivers that flowed wherever nature guided them, mountains wrapped in ice, and plains that seemed to continue forever. Far in the distance, a herd of woolly mammoths slowly crossed the frozen earth. Their thick coats protected them from the bitter cold, while their enormous curved tusks pushed aside snow in search of buried grass. Nearby, ancient bison grazed together peacefully. Wild horses moved carefully across the open land, always alert for danger. Among all these great animals walked a small group of people. There were only a few families. They traveled together because together meant survival. The oldest members carried memories of many winters. The strongest hunters watched every movement across the horizon. Mothers carefully wrapped young children in warm animal hides, protecting them from the freezing wind. Even the youngest children were already learning to notice animal tracks, changing clouds, and the direction of the wind. Every day was a lesson. Every season taught something new. Food could never be taken for granted. Some mornings began with hope, others began with uncertainty. The people understood that nature decided everything. When the herds moved, they moved. When rivers froze, they found another path. When storms arrived, they waited patiently until the skies became calm once again. No one carried maps. Instead, the land itself became their guide. The stars showed direction during clear nights. The rivers pointed toward fresh water. The animals often revealed where food could be found. Nothing in nature was ignored. Everything had meaning. As the days slowly passed, the families stopped beside a gentle stream that had not yet frozen completely. The hunters carefully examined fresh footprints pressed into the soft ground near the water. Mammoths had passed through only a short time earlier. No one rushed. Patience was often more valuable than speed. While some people prepared simple stone tools, others gathered dry grass and broken branches for a small evening fire. Children quietly helped however they could, carrying pieces of wood no larger than their own arms. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the distant horizon, the temperature began to fall once again. a small fire flickered to life. Its warm orange glow danced gently across tired faces. The families gathered together. No one spoke loudly. There was no need. The fire itself seemed to tell its own story. One of the elders looked toward the darkening sky where countless stars slowly appeared, one after another. Those same stars had watched over countless generations before them, and they would continue watching long after everyone around the fire was gone. The elder began telling an old story, not a story about kings or battles, but a story about listening. Listening to the wind, listening to the rivers, listening to the animals. Because those who truly listened would always find the path forward. The children watched the glowing fire with quiet eyes. They did not know that beyond the frozen horizon lay a vast new land unlike anything their families had ever seen. They did not know that future generations would one day call those lands North America. To them, tomorrow was simply another day of walking, another sunrise, another chance to survive. And as the fire slowly faded into glowing embers beneath a sky filled with endless stars, the first steps toward one of humanity's greatest journeys were already beginning. As the first light of morning slowly spread across the frozen horizon, the camp quietly came to life. No loud voices disturbed the silence. Only the gentle crackling of the dying fire and the distant calls of birds echoed across the endless grasslands. The children stretched beneath warm animal hides, while the older members of the group looked toward the east, carefully studying the sky before another day of travel began. But where were they really going? None of them knew. There was no leader holding a map. No one pointed toward a distant destination. Instead, they trusted something far older than maps. They trusted the land. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now, let's continue our quiet walk into the distant past. The hunters stepped away from the camp before the sun had fully risen. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering yesterday's footprints beneath a soft white blanket. Yet new tracks had already appeared. Large, round impressions pressed deeply into the snow. A herd of mammoths had passed through only hours before. The hunters smiled quietly. Not because they expected an easy hunt, but because the animals were leading them forward once again. The families packed their few belongings with practiced hands. Warm furs were folded. Stone tools were carefully wrapped. Small children climbed onto simple wooden sleds pulled by strong hands across the frozen ground. Soon the camp disappeared behind them. Only a circle of cooling ashes remained, slowly disappearing beneath the wind. Hour after hour they continued walking. Sometimes they crossed frozen rivers that groaned softly beneath the thick ice. Sometimes they climbed gentle hills where the cold wind became stronger. From those higher places they could see an endless sea of grass, stretching toward the horizon. There were no borders, no signs, only nature. The journey itself had become their way of life. As the afternoon sun hung low above the plains, the group stopped beside a quiet stream where clear water still flowed beneath thin sheets of ice. The children laughed softly as they watched tiny fish swimming below the frozen surface. Nearby, two women gathered dry grasses that would help start another evening fire. One of the elders slowly knelt beside the water and looked at the reflection of the sky. The clouds were changing. He knew that snow would arrive again before long. No one questioned his judgment. Years of watching nature had taught him lessons that no written book could ever contain. As evening returned, another small fire warmed the circle of families. The hunters had not caught a mammoth today, but they had found smaller game, enough to share among everyone. For them, every meal was a reason for quiet gratitude. Around the fire, the oldest storyteller began speaking once more. He reminded the children that every step they took became part of a story that their own grandchildren would one day remember. The children listened without fully understanding. To them, tomorrow would simply be another day of walking, another sunrise, another trail, another quiet adventure across a land that seemed to have no end. Yet beyond the western horizon, unseen by every person around that fire, an entirely new world waited patiently. With every peaceful step they took, they were moving closer to becoming the first people to call that distant land home. The next morning arrived beneath a sky painted with soft shades of silver and pale blue. Frost covered the grass, and every breath drifted gently into the cold air before disappearing. The camp slowly awakened, not because anyone hurried, but because the land itself seemed to whisper that it was time to move once again. Have you ever wondered how people could spend their entire lives walking without ever knowing where the journey would finally end? For these families, every new sunrise brought another unknown horizon, another quiet path, and another lesson from the world around them. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now, let your mind become as calm as the frozen landscape before us, and let's continue our story. The travelers packed their few belongings with the same careful routine they had followed countless times before. Animal hides were folded, stone tools were tied together with leather straps. The fire was gently covered until only warm ashes remained, leaving almost no trace that anyone had ever camped there. Soon they were walking once again. The wind blew softly across the open plains, carrying with it the scent of cold earth and distant grass. Small birds fluttered overhead, while a group of Arctic foxes disappeared between low shrubs in search of food. The children had begun noticing things they had never seen before. New plants pushed through the frozen soil. Different birds circled high above. The rivers no longer flowed exactly as they had many seasons ago. The land was changing, slowly, almost too slowly to notice. But the elders noticed. One of them paused on a small hill and looked far toward the western horizon. There, beyond the endless grasslands, the world seemed different somehow. The air felt slightly warmer. Snow no longer covered every patch of ground. Thin lines of dark earth stretched across the landscape, hinting that another season was quietly approaching. No one spoke, yet everyone felt it. Nature was leading them somewhere new. As the afternoon passed, the group discovered a wide valley filled with fresh grass. A herd of ancient bison grazed peacefully in the distance, paying little attention to the travelers. The hunters watched quietly. There was no need to chase. Patience had always been their greatest skill. They waited until the wind carried their scent away from the animals. Only then did they slowly move closer, taking one careful step after another. The hunt was successful, not because of strength, but because of teamwork. That evening, everyone shared the meal together. No one ate alone. The youngest children received food first, then the elders. Only after everyone else had enough did the hunters take their own share. It was a simple tradition, but one that kept the families united through every difficult season. Later, as darkness settled across the valley, thousands of stars slowly filled the sky. The storyteller looked upward and smiled. He pointed toward a group of bright stars rising above the horizon. "Our ancestors looked at these same stars," he whispered, "and one day our grandchildren will look at them too." The children followed his finger into the night sky. They could never imagine that countless generations later, people would still wonder about their lives. To them, the stars were simply old friends that appeared every evening, guiding them through another peaceful night. The fire grew smaller. The voices became quieter. One by one, everyone drifted to sleep beneath blankets of warm animal hides. Beyond the darkness, the land stretched farther than anyone could see. And somewhere ahead, just beyond the next river and the next valley, the first doorway into a new continent was waiting in complete silence. Morning arrived with a quiet stillness that only the Ice Age could bring. The frozen grass shimmered beneath the first rays of sunlight, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of snow across the open plain. The families awoke slowly, their camp peaceful and unhurried, as though the land itself was still asleep. Have you ever wondered if there was a single moment when the first Native Americans unknowingly entered a completely new world? There was no sign to welcome them, no river marked the beginning, no mountain announced that history was about to change. Only the endless land stretched before them. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now relax, breathe slowly, and let's continue our story. The travelers continued west, following the familiar trails left behind by great herds of mammoths and bison. Those animals had become their quiet guides, leading them toward fresh grasslands, clean water, and safer places to rest. The ground beneath their feet looked much the same as it had for many seasons: wide plains, gentle hills, frozen streams. Yet something was changing. The air felt different. The wind no longer carried the same bitter cold that had followed them for so many years. Small patches of green appeared beside melting snow. Tiny flowers, no larger than a child's hand, quietly pushed through the frozen earth, welcoming the return of another spring. The children noticed them first. They knelt beside the flowers with curious smiles, gently touching the soft petals as though discovering a wonderful secret. The elders smiled. Every new season brought another reminder that life always returned, even after the longest winter. As the sun climbed higher, the families reached a broad river unlike any they had crossed before. The water moved calmly, reflecting the bright sky above like polished glass. For a long moment, everyone simply stood in silence. The hunters searched both banks for signs of danger. Fresh animal tracks covered the muddy shore. Elk, bison, foxes, even mammoths had crossed here only days before. The river was alive, and where animals gathered, people could survive. The families decided to rest there for several days. Children collected smooth stones along the riverbank. Women washed carefully sewn animal hides in the cold water. The hunters repaired their spears, replacing worn stone points with newly shaped ones crafted from carefully chosen rock. Nearby, one of the elders sat quietly, watching birds fly overhead. Every spring they returned, every autumn they disappeared again. Nature followed its own gentle rhythm, and the people had learned long ago that life became easier when they followed that rhythm too. That evening, the campfire burned brightly beside the river. The storyteller spoke of the great herds that had guided their ancestors for longer than anyone could remember. He reminded the children that people never truly owned the land. Instead, they belonged to it. The rivers gave them water. The animals gave them food. The trees offered warmth. In return, they took only what they needed, nothing more. The fire slowly settled into glowing embers. Above them, countless stars stretched from one horizon to the other. Somewhere beyond those distant plains, hidden behind mountains they had never seen, forests were waiting, great rivers were waiting, endless valleys were waiting. And with every peaceful sunrise that followed, these quiet travelers moved one step closer to becoming the first people to call that vast new land their home. The gentle sound of flowing water welcomed another peaceful morning. Mist drifted above the river as the first rays of sunlight slowly warmed the frozen ground. Birds filled the quiet air with soft calls, while the camp remained still for a few precious moments before another day of travel began. Have you ever wondered what gave these families the courage to keep walking, even though they had no idea what waited beyond the next hill. Every sunrise brought uncertainty, yet they continued forward with patience, hope, and complete trust in the world around them. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now, settle in comfortably, take a slow breath, and let's continue our story. The families left the river behind as the morning grew brighter. Ahead of them, the land slowly began to change. The endless open plains became dotted with small groves of trees. The air felt softer than before, and the cold wind no longer bit quite as sharply against their faces. The children noticed new sounds. Birds they had never heard before sang from the branches. Small rabbits darted through the tall grass. Colorful wildflowers covered patches of ground where snow had melted only a few days earlier. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet nothing felt frightening. The land seemed to welcome them quietly. As they walked, one of the elders stopped beside an enormous tree. Its trunk was wider than any tree the children had ever seen. He gently placed his hand against the rough bark and smiled. For a long moment, no one spoke. The children watched with curiosity. Finally, the elder whispered that every tree, every river, and every mountain had its own story, even if people could not hear it. The journey continued through the peaceful woodland. Sunlight filtered gently through the branches, creating dancing patterns across the forest floor. The hunters moved silently, not because danger was near, but because respect for nature had always guided their steps. Around midday they discovered a small clearing where fresh deer tracks covered the soft earth. The hunters quietly studied the footprints. The animals were healthy. They had passed through only a short time before. This time the hunt was successful. It was quick, respectful. And when it was over, everyone silently thanked the animal for providing food, warm clothing, and materials that would help the families survive another season. Nothing was wasted. The meat would feed everyone. The hide would become warm clothing. The bones would become tools. Even the sinew would become strong thread for sewing. Nature had given them another gift. As evening arrived, a new camp was built beneath tall trees that gently swayed in the cool breeze. The fire burned softly, its warm light reflected in the eyes of children listening to another story from the elder. He spoke of patience. He reminded them that the greatest journeys were never measured by how quickly people walked, but by how carefully they learned from every step. The children looked toward the dark forest beyond the firelight. Somewhere out there, countless rivers, mountains, and valleys still waited to be discovered. They did not know that generations from now, their descendants would build thousands of different communities across this vast continent. Tonight, they were simply grateful for warmth, family, food, and another peaceful day that had carried them a little farther into a beautiful and unknown world. As the stars slowly filled the night sky once again, the fire crackled gently, and the quiet journey toward a new homeland continued with the same calm determination that had guided them from the very beginning. The forest was still asleep when the first bird began to sing. A cool breeze drifted gently through the tall trees, carrying the fresh scent of pine, damp earth, and morning dew. Tiny drops of water rested on every leaf, sparkling softly as the rising sun slowly reached the forest floor. Have you ever wondered when these travelers first realized that this land was no longer just another place to pass through? That perhaps, somewhere ahead, they had found a place where future generations would one day call home? If you're enjoying these peaceful journeys through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales Asleep. Now relax your shoulders, take another slow breath, and let the story continue. The camp slowly came to life. A young girl stepped quietly toward the river with a small container made from animal hide. The water was cold against her hands, but it was clear and fresh. She smiled as tiny fish darted beneath the surface before disappearing into the gentle current. Nearby, two boys searched for smooth stones that could be shaped into useful tools. They laughed quietly each time they found one that fit perfectly in their hands. The hunters stood together, looking toward the distant hills. Something had changed. For many days they had noticed larger forests, richer rivers, and more animals than ever before. This land could provide everything they needed: fresh water, healthy game, shelter, firewood. It was generous. One of the elders walked slowly through the trees, carefully observing everything around him. He touched the bark of unfamiliar trees, smelled new plants growing beside fallen logs, and listened to birds whose songs had never echoed across the frozen plains they had once known. Nature was introducing itself, and the people listened with quiet respect. That afternoon, instead of continuing their journey, the families decided to remain where they were. Children helped gather fallen branches, while others collected berries growing near the edge of a sunny clearing. The adults carefully built stronger shelters using long wooden poles covered with animal hides. Unlike the camps before, this one felt different. It was built with a little more care, a little more hope. No one said they would stay forever, but no one seemed eager to leave. As the sun slowly crossed the sky, the hunters returned carrying two young deer. Everyone gathered to help. The meat was prepared with patience. The hides were carefully cleaned. Strong bones were set aside to become needles, fishing hooks, and tools for future seasons. Nothing was ever wasted. Every gift from nature carried responsibility. That evening, after everyone had eaten, silence settled over the camp. The storyteller looked around the circle before speaking. "Our ancestors followed the animals," he said softly. "The animals led us to rivers. The rivers led us to forests. And perhaps, he paused for a moment, watching the firelight dance across the faces of the children. Perhaps the forests have led us here for a reason. No one answered. The only sound came from the gentle crackling of the fire. Above them, thousands of stars quietly filled the night sky. The same stars had watched these families since the beginning of their journey, yet tonight felt different. For the first time in many seasons, tomorrow did not seem to demand another long walk. Instead, it offered something they had almost forgotten: the chance to simply stay, to rest, to learn the rhythms of a new land. And as sleep slowly came to the camp beneath the whispering trees, the dream of a permanent home began to take shape, quietly, gently, and without anyone realizing that the morning arrived quietly, wrapped in a blanket of soft mist that floated above the river. The forest seemed to breathe with gentle rhythm, and for the first time in many seasons, no one hurried to pack their belongings. The camp remained peaceful, as though the land itself was inviting them to stay just a little longer. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to wake up one morning and realize that a place no longer felt unfamiliar? That the rivers, the trees, and the songs of the birds were slowly becoming part of your own story? If you're enjoying these peaceful journeys through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now, let your breathing become slow and steady as we continue our story. The children were the first to notice the change. They no longer asked where the families would travel next. Instead, they spent their mornings exploring the nearby forest, learning where berries grew, where rabbits hid among the bushes, and where fresh water flowed after the spring rains. The adults watched with quiet smiles. The children were no longer simply surviving in this land. They were beginning to understand it. Every day brought another lesson. The hunters discovered familiar paths used by deer and elk. The women found new plants whose roots could be cooked over the fire. The elders carefully observed the changing weather, noticing how the clouds gathered before rain, and how certain birds always appeared just before the seasons changed. Little by little, the land shared its secrets. One afternoon, the oldest storyteller gathered the children beneath the shade of a great tree. He picked up a handful of soil and gently let it fall through his fingers. "This land remembers," he said softly. "It remembers every river that has flowed here, every tree that has grown, every animal that has walked these forests, and now," he smiled warmly, "it will remember us too." The children listened quietly. They did not fully understand his words, but they felt the kindness in his voice. As summer slowly approached, the days became longer. Wildflowers covered the open meadows with soft colors, Bees drifted peacefully from flower to flower. Butterflies floated through the warm afternoon air. The forests that had once seemed mysterious now felt welcoming. The families began returning to the same places to gather food. They knew where fish could be found. They remembered which trees offered shelter during heavy rain. Every season added another piece to their growing knowledge. That evening, a gentle rain began to fall. No one feared it. The shelters held strong. Inside, families sat together beside small fires, quietly repairing clothing, shaping stone tools, and telling stories while the soft sound of rain echoed through the forest. The storyteller spoke of patience once again. He reminded everyone that the strongest tree in the forest had not grown in a single season. It had stood through countless winters. It had welcomed countless springs. And because it had been patient, it had become strong. The children slowly drifted to sleep as the rain continued outside. The adults sat silently for a while, watching the glowing embers of the fire. Beyond the forest, rivers continued their endless journey toward distant seas. Mountains waited beneath quiet skies. Wide valleys stretched beyond the horizon. The world was still filled with places these families had never seen. But tonight, surrounded by the gentle sounds of rain and the warmth of their camp, they no longer felt like strangers. Without realizing it, they had begun planting something far greater. The gentle rain had passed during the night, leaving the forest fresh and peaceful. Tiny drops of water clung to every leaf, catching the morning sunlight like countless little crystals. A thin layer of mist drifted above the river, and the songs of birds echoed softly through the trees as another beautiful day quietly began. Have you ever wondered how the first Native Americans learned to understand a land they had never seen before? They had no books to teach them, no maps to guide them, and no written instructions. Their greatest teacher was nature itself. If you're enjoying these peaceful journeys through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now, take a slow, comfortable breath and let's continue our story. The camp had become calmer with each passing day. The children knew where to collect fresh berries. The hunters recognized the paths taken by deer before sunrise. The elders could almost predict the weather simply by watching the movement of clouds and listening to the morning birds. The land no longer felt unfamiliar, it felt alive. Every river seemed to tell a story, every tree offered quiet shelter. Every sunrise revealed something new. One afternoon, a young boy wandered only a short distance from the camp while searching for smooth stones beside a small stream. As he knelt near the water, he noticed something unusual. A large set of footprints pressed deeply into the soft mud. They were fresh, very fresh. The boy remained perfectly still, just as the elders had taught him. Moments later, a magnificent bull moose stepped silently from the trees, its enormous antlers stretched wide above its head, shining softly beneath the afternoon light. The animal lowered its head to drink from the stream. The boy watched without making a sound. For several peaceful moments, neither moved. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, the great animal disappeared back into the forest. When the boy returned to camp, he told the elders what he had seen. They smiled proudly, not because he had found a great animal, but because he had shown patience. Nature always revealed its greatest wonders to those who learned to be still. That evening, the storyteller shared another lesson around the fire. He spoke about respect. He explained that every creature carried its own place within the world. The mammoths, the deer, the birds, even the smallest insects, each one helped keep nature in balance. People were not above the land, they were part of it. The children listened carefully as sparks drifted upward into the star-filled sky. Slowly they began to understand that survival was not only about finding food, it was also about learning when to wait, when to listen, and when to leave nature undisturbed. As the seasons continued to change, the families noticed that they no longer spent every day searching for the unknown. Instead, they were beginning to remember familiar rivers, favorite campsites, and safe places where they could always find fresh water. Without realizing it, memories of the land were becoming part of their own history. The same paths they walk today would one day be walked by their children, and by the children who came after them. As the fire slowly settled into glowing embers, the oldest elder looked toward the dark forest and smiled. The journey that had once been about survival was quietly becoming something much greater. It was becoming a home. And beyond the distant mountains, countless more rivers, valleys, and forests patiently waited for future generations to discover, each one ready to become another chapter in the long and peaceful story of the first Native Americans. The morning sun rose gently above the distant hills, filling the valley with a warm golden light. A soft breeze moved through the trees, and the river flowed as peacefully as it had the day before. The camp awakened slowly, surrounded by familiar sounds that no longer felt strange. Birds greeted the morning from the branches above, while children smiled as they recognized the songs they had learned over many changing seasons. Have you ever wondered when a journey finally becomes a home? Perhaps it isn't marked by a single day. Perhaps it happens quietly, one sunrise at a time, until the land begins to feel like family. If you're enjoying these peaceful journeys through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let's continue our story. The families had spent many moons exploring the forests, rivers, and open meadows around them. Every season had taught them something new. Spring showed them where fresh plants appeared after the snow melted. Summer filled the rivers with fish and the forests with berries. Autumn offered nuts, roots, and game before winter returned. Even winter, though difficult, reminded them which valleys stayed sheltered from the strongest winds. The land had become their teacher. The children who had once depended on the elders were growing older. Now they could recognize animal tracks without help. They could shape simple stone tools with careful hands. They knew how to start a fire, how to gather clean water, and how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the animals. Knowledge was no longer held by only a few. It was being shared with a new generation. One peaceful afternoon, the hunters climbed a rocky hillside overlooking the valley below. From there they could see rivers winding through the forests like shining ribbons. Small herds of deer grazed peacefully beside the water. Birds circled high above the trees. For a long time, no one spoke. The view before them was more than beautiful. It was familiar. One hunter quietly smiled. Without saying a word, he understood what everyone else was feeling. This land was no longer simply a place they had reached. It had become part of who they were. That evening, families gathered around the fire once again. The storyteller looked around the circle before speaking. "When our ancestors first began walking," he said softly, "they searched for food. When they crossed the great grasslands, they searched for safety. But now," he looked toward the forest surrounding the camp, "we have found something even greater. A place where our children can grow. A place where their children will one day tell these same stories." The fire crackled gently as everyone sat in peaceful silence. No one celebrated loudly. There was no need. The greatest moments in life often arrive quietly. The stars slowly appeared above the valley, just as they always had. Yet tonight they seemed different somehow. Not because the sky had changed, but because the people beneath it had. The long journey across the frozen world had shaped them into something new, not strangers passing through an unfamiliar land, but the first caretakers of a place that would one day become home to countless generations. As sleep gently settled over the camp, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of many more seasons to come. And although these families could never know it, the story they had begun would continue for thousands of years, growing into hundreds of unique nations, languages, and traditions across a vast and beautiful continent. The night was calm, and the last embers of the campfire glowed softly beneath a sky filled with countless stars. A cool breeze drifted through the trees, carrying the familiar sounds of flowing water and distant birds settling into the forest. The children were already asleep, wrapped in warm animal hides, while the elders quietly watched the stars that had guided their people for generations. Have you ever wondered what became of those first families after their long journey finally slowed? They did not disappear into history. Instead, their footsteps echoed across the centuries, becoming the beginning of a remarkable human story that is still alive today. Before we end tonight's journey, if you've enjoyed this peaceful walk through history, please consider subscribing to Nova's Sleepy Tales. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your evening. Now let's gently bring this story to its quiet ending. The years continued to pass. Children became parents. Parents became elders. The stories shared around the fire were passed to new voices, just as they always had been. With every passing generation, families explored new rivers, crossed distant valleys, climbed unfamiliar mountains, and followed winding coastlines that stretched farther than anyone had imagined. Some groups remained among the forests. Others settled beside wide rivers rich with fish. Some made homes across open grasslands where great herds still wandered. Others slowly reached deserts, high mountains, and the shores of vast oceans. Although they traveled in different directions, they all carried the same lessons their ancestors had learned long before. Respect the land. Take only what you need. Share with your family. Listen to the seasons. Be patient. These quiet values became the foundation upon which countless future communities would grow. Over thousands of years, new languages would emerge. Different traditions would blossom. Unique songs, ceremonies, and ways of life would develop across the continent. Every community would understand the land in its own special way. Yet deep beneath those beautiful differences remained the memory of an ancient journey that had begun during the final days of the Ice Age. Today, scientists continue to uncover pieces of that remarkable story through archaeology, ancient campsites, carefully crafted stone tools, and discoveries preserved beneath layers of earth and ice. At the same time, indigenous communities continue to protect and share traditions that have been carried from one generation to the next for countless centuries. Together, these discoveries and living traditions help us understand the incredible story of the first Native Americans with ever greater respect and care. As the fire slowly faded into glowing ash, the oldest storyteller looked one final time toward the stars. He smiled peacefully. "The journey never truly ends," he whispered. "It simply becomes the path for those who walk after us." The children slept peacefully, unaware that one day their descendants would spread across an entire continent, building rich cultures and caring for the lands that had welcomed their ancestors so many thousands of years before. The river continued its endless journey. The forest breathed quietly in the night. The stars remained exactly where they had always been. And somewhere within that endless silence, The first footsteps into a new world became the beginning of one of humanity's most extraordinary stories. Thank you for joining this peaceful journey through the distant past. Sleep well. And until our next story, may your dreams be as calm as the ancient forests, as endless as the quiet grasslands, and as timeless as the stars that watched over the first Native Americans.